Okay, so I think we'll get started now. Welcome everyone to the penultimate session in this Reducing Scope 3 Emissions series. So today we'll be looking at emissions arising from purchased goods and services and capital goods. So I just want to thank our partners for the series, PA Consulting, Shoesmiths and Owen Mumford, for the brilliant support. Additionally, before I run through some housekeeping, just to flag some other events we've got coming up at the moment. So on the 27th of June, we are hosting an event at London Climate Action Week. And that webinar is going to focus on investor perspectives on climate and human rights. We've also still got one other event in this series, and we'll be looking at fuel and energy related emissions, categories 3 of the greenhouse gas protocol scope 3 standard. That's on the 5th of July. Okay, so I'll just run through some housekeeping then as well before I hand over to Steve. So the event firstly is being recorded. Don't worry about making too many notes. I'll send that recording round with some key takeaways after the event. We're also activating automatic captions, so you can choose to accept these in the tools bar. These captions are automatically generated by Zoom, so do forgive any typos or mistakes, please. We're also in webinar mode today, so that means the audience will be muted throughout. That doesn't mean we don't want to hear from you though, so please, any questions you've got, please post them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Anything else though, please post that in the chat box. So introductions, useful links, we'll be sharing some useful links in there, so keep an eye out for them. But please remember questions in the Q&A box, and that just helps with the moderation of the question and answer part at the end of the session. You can also upvote any questions which you like the look of. Ultimately, the ones with the most upvotes will probably be asked to our panelists. So yeah, keep an eye out for that as well. Okay, so just before I hand over to Steve, then I'll share the results of the poll, and it's an interesting one. So again, we've got a lot of people struggling with data availability when addressing these categories, and also knowledge of methodology and ability to influence and engage suppliers. So hopefully today we'll be able to go through and help address some of these challenges for attendees. Okay, so with that, I'm really happy to hand over to Steve Kenzie, who is the Executive Director of the UN Global Compact Network UK. Steve, over to you.
Thanks very much, Patrick, and welcome everyone. Great to have such a good group with us and a fantastic lineup of speakers for you today on such an important topic. Now, I have a little bit more housekeeping that we need to go through. So let's just go to that next slide. And this is for those of you that have attended some of our other sessions. Sadly, this has become a regular part of it, but it's absolutely so critical. The situation in Ukraine is not getting better. They desperately need your support. We need to keep awareness of the situation there high. The number of refugees, both having fled the country or displaced internally, is truly astounding in a bad way. If there's anything you can do to help, please step up. If you're not sure what you can do to help, we put some links into the chat where you can connect with the UNHCR, the UN High Commission for Refugees, and they can help you to direct your support where it can be most productive. So do follow up on that or get in touch with us, and we'll be very happy to make those connections. Okay, let's move on to our next slide. And again, for those of you that have joined some of these webinars previously, nothing new, but for those of you that are not so aware of the UN Global Compact, we are the world's largest corporate sustainability initiative with over 16,000 companies participating globally and another 3,800 non-business organizations that have made the commitment to our 10 principles of corporate sustainability. These principles are derived from UN treaties in the areas of human rights, labor, environment, and anti-corruption, which makes them truly universal and a very strong foundation for our initiative. If your organization isn't already in the Global Compact, we would be very happy to speak with you about that. So do get in touch. It's quite straightforward, really. Your CEO needs to make 3 commitments. First, to operationalize the Global Compact principles throughout your organization. Secondly, to report annually on the progress that you're making towards doing so. And finally, to support the wider UN development agenda, which at the moment is best represented by the UN Sustainable Development Goals. There are local networks in 70 countries around the world, with more opening all the time. And it is our role to support our participants in fulfilling the commitments that they've made. We seek to raise ambition for corporate sustainability and to enable practical action. We have 3 work streams here in the UK network: business and human rights, climate action, and global goals. We deliver more than 100 events a year to support our members and the wider business community. And our colleagues in other local networks around the world are doing the same. So please do get involved if you're not already. And Patrick mentioned some of our upcoming events. We'll have a little bit more on that at the end. And as always, some links in the chat box. Okay, let's go to the next slide, and I'll introduce our fantastic panel of speakers for today. So we're going to be focused on how businesses can best measure and reduce their Scope 3 emissions associated with purchased goods and services and capital goods. To help us do that, we have Amelie Tan, UK and worldwide regional lead for the Commit to Action program at CDP and SBTi. We've also got Sonya Bhonsle, Global Head of Value Chains and Regional Director for Corporations at the CDP. Then we'll hear from Rodrigo Barrios, Climate Change Manager, Supply Chains for Tesco. And then finally, Isobel Filipova, Design Engineer, Sustainable Product Development, Research and Development at Owen Mumford. Fabulous experts. We're really looking forward to hearing from them and to taking on your questions. Just let me reiterate again how vital it is that you put your questions in the Q&A box. We have a very large audience today. We anticipate that we're going to get quite a few questions. It's going to be very difficult for me to keep track of questions in both the Q&A box and in the chat box, but also really important that there are features in the Q&A box that allow your question to be voted up, and thereby improving the likelihood that it will be answered, and also possibilities for us to type in written answers, which will let us get through more questions. So just again, to reiterate that, questions in the Q&A box, comments, chats, your LinkedIn address in the chat box, all great stuff. And without any further ado, let's move on and hear from Amelie.
Thank you so much, Steve, for the introduction. Again, my name is Amelie Tan, and I lead engagement on science-based targets for the UK and worldwide region from the Transition Accelerator team, previously known as Commit to Action. So today I'll be providing a short overview of the SBTi and Scope 3 target setting criteria, and followed by a closer look at categories 1 and 2 of Scope 3 emissions. And next slide, please. And so I'll start by introducing the Science-Based Targets Initiative, or the SBTi as it's widely known. The SBTi was founded in 2015, just before the Paris Agreement, as a collaboration between 4 founding organizations, namely the CDP, UN Global Compact, World Resources Institute, and WWF. So the SBTi drives corporate climate action by enabling companies to set emissions reduction targets that are aligned with science. And in 2021, we saw the number of companies committing and setting targets with the SBTi double. So this brings the global market cap coverage with science-based targets to more than 35%, which is about $38 trillion US. And by now, science-based targets have emerged as the gold standard of climate targets, and stakeholders, including investors and corporate customers, are really more commonly expecting companies to have these kinds of robust targets in place in order to future-proof your business for the low carbon economy. And I'd like you to check out the 2021 progress report from the SBTi, linked from this slide, but I think, it should be shared in the chat shortly as well. So next slide, please. So looking closer on science-based targets, what are they exactly? So science-based targets provide a clearly defined pathway for companies to, and as well as financial institutions, to determine how much and how fast you need to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions in line with the latest science, which tells us that we need to limit warming to 1.5 degrees compared to pre-industrial levels. And based on time frame, there are two types of science-based targets. The first one is the near-term targets that span about 5 to 10 years. And this was developed back in 2015 that companies have been setting since the inception of the SBTi. So the near-term targets are breaking down the long-term trajectory to net zero. So these shorter timeframes allow companies to provide better accountability for stakeholders, and it helps to facilitate internal discussion and decision-making on corporate risk management and strategy, as well as for external communication for being on track towards net zero. And then the second type of long-term or net zero science-based targets, which the SBTi began validating this year, defines a long-term commitment for deep decarbonization towards net zero emissions. And as a final note on this slide, it is important that companies publicly disclose their emissions on an annual basis. This is to provide transparency on your progress towards your validated targets to a wider group of stakeholders. And also, this is a requirement for companies who have approved targets from the SBTi. Next slide, please. So looking closer on scope 3 target setting overview. So for companies that have a 40% or more of your overall emissions coming from scope 3, will need to set a target on this category. And the coverage of your scope 3 targets needs to provide at least 2/3 of your scope 3 emissions. This is to ensure that a sufficient amount of emissions are covered by your targets. And again, in the time frame is about 5 to 10 years, and this is counting from the year or the date that your targets is submitted for validation. So there are a variety of target setting approaches which can be used for scope 3 target setting as well. The scope 3 targets emissions come from a wider range of sources in 15 categories, including the 2 that we're going to look at today. So a combination of targets or a single target is available for companies to utilize to provide that flexibility. There is a link that is provided as well to bring you to the resources page of the SBTi website, which provides a lot more guidance resources. Next slide, please. So for scope 3 target setting methods, there are 2 main options. The first one is the emissions reduction targets. So in the interest of time, I won't go through each of these target setting methods, but more guidance is also available in the corporate manual, linked on this slide also. Next slide, please. And the second option is the supplier or customer engagement targets. So this is applied either upstream or downstream for customers or suppliers to set their own targets. And the formulation of these targets looks at setting a percentage of emissions from categories covered by the target. And I have to say that we're seeing more companies that choose to use this target setting method for upstream emissions coming mainly from purchased goods and services and capital goods. Because of the power of procurement. As a customer, you are better able to negotiate this kind of ask from your suppliers. All right, so the next slide. This is really looking at the various considerations when you look at near-term and long-term target setting with the SBTi. And you see that the SBTi has taken an expansive boundary approach for scope 3. We're moving from the near-term to the long-term net zero targets, whereby the minimum coverage in the near-term is 67%, but expands to 90% minimum for the long-term. This is because a comprehensive target boundary is necessary for companies to make credible net zero claims at the end of your decarbonization journey. But we acknowledge that the companies may have challenges with scope 3, especially with the data availability as you voted in the poll. So there is more leniency of up to 1/3 of scope 3 emissions that can be excluded. Next slide, please. So looking closer at these two categories, companies, it's important for companies to include both direct and indirect procurements, for your scope 1 and 2. And direct procurement basically is looking at intermediate goods, that are that go into your production of your goods and services. So these are materials, components, and parts, and also final goods for retail as well as capital goods, which is not immediately used or processed. So capital goods is kind of reported in a separate category in category 2. Whereas indirect procurement looks at procurement that is necessary for your operations and maintenance, like your office equipment and furniture. And if you look at the emissions boundary, is requiring you to look at all upstream, meaning cradle to gate emissions, and you need to include these emissions in your reporting year that you have procured it. So capital goods, I want to highlight some examples. Again, it's like equipment, machinery. So, purchases that you make that may not go immediately into your product, but it helps you to facilitate the operations that make the operation possible. Okay, next slide, please. So here I just have a few examples of companies that have set targets for the near term, especially for these two categories. For Simrise, you see that they're looking at an absolute target on scope 1. So this is just a percentage reduction by a target year. Whereas Decathlon has chosen to use an engagement target specifically for scope 1, sorry, category 1. And AstraZeneca, again, uses engagement target, but is across categories 1 and 2. And they also include more scope 3 target setting approaches, to facilitate a better communication of where they are targeting in terms of their target setting approaches. And as I mentioned earlier, this is possible to have more than one scope 3 targets in place, as long as overall your combined targets cover at least 2/3 of your emissions for near-term targets. Next slide, please. So to conclude, on this slide, I have included some useful links, but I want to make a special mention to the UN Global Compact's e-learning course on science-based targets for the basics, as well as the net zero standard that was launched just yesterday. So I highly encourage everyone to spend some time to go through this if you're not yet familiar with it. It takes about 20 to 30 minutes maximum. So it's very good for like a quick educational session for yourself. Thank you so much. And I'll pass it back to Steve.
Thank you, Amelie. A lot in there. Lots of questions coming in, which is really great. And we'll circle back perhaps to flesh out some of those details. But before we do that, we're going to go on, and now we'll hear from Sonya.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you for having me here in DC. These events are wonderful. If we go on to the next slide. For those of you who don't know us, my name's Sonya Bhonsle. I'm Global Head of Value Chains at CDP. CDP is a not-for-profit organisation that's been in operation for about 20 years. We collect data from thousands of companies from all over the world in varying sizes on behalf of 590 institutional investors who represent about $130 trillion of assets under management, and 280 purchasers who roughly spend about $6.4 trillion, which is not an instance, which is quite a sizable amount. So what I'm going to do is talk you through a little bit about what CDP's seen from the data we've collected, but also from some of the work we've been doing with purchasers over the last 15 years on scope 3. Come to the next slide. So what have we seen? Well, we were there and we were part of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol working group when it was launched, and that was phenomenal. It really started to order people's thinking on scope 3. I've only just stopped calling it the new protocol. It's not new. I'm sure it must be over a decade old now. But it really was wonderful. But what did we see? Well, everyone automatically gravitated towards business travel. It was familiar, it was controlled. There was a lot more experience in reporting that aspect of their upstream emissions. And it's been slow bridging the majority of companies out of business travel. But it's necessary. And for the two categories we're talking about here, purchased goods and services and capital goods, because they're cradle to gate, they represent a fantastic amount of emissions upstream. It's material, and the investors, the media, the stakeholders have learned how material those two particular categories are. Now, overall upstream emissions from our analysis is in excess of 1.4 times that of an operational emissions. And that, you know, that kind of thinking and that knowledge is settling in. And it's not the business travel in most cases, it is the capital goods and purchase goods and services. And so from there, what we've really been thinking, and in collaboration with the investors and the purchasers we work with, is we need to get more people reporting on those categories. We need to make sure that the material upstream scope 3 emissions are being calculated and reported against. So we've done some additional analysis, and I am going to share links. There's lots of links going on. I'll put it out after I've finished. We've done some initial analysis and highlighted which scope 3 categories are most relevant, because it's a relevancy bit, are relevant for which sector. And there's a white paper, and that's a resource for investors and companies to help guide them in their thinking. And off the back of that, we saw that for most sectors, those two categories were material. There are some that aren't, oil and gas, but for those particular for most sectors, if you click in when I send this link, you'll see it's material. Now, here's the bit where a couple of companies' heads are going to look up. Off the back of that, because of the material impact of scope 3, we've actually started to softly change scoring to reflect that to reflect the importance of scope 3 emissions. And we've introduced some sector-based scoring on the scope 3 emissions questions for the very first time this year. It's a very soft step, but it shows you the direction we're going. And it also was very firmly backed by the investors that we work with. If we go on to the next slide. I'll skirt through the last few ones relatively quickly, but here are some changes that I've seen coming from companies. The first is that the necessity of cradle to gate meant for these purchased goods and services, what we'd seen is most companies coming in and starting their assessment based solely on input-output methodologies. Those are at the bottom there, the spend-based method, the average database method. That was where most companies stood, and that's where most companies are. But we've seen, and you can thank Amelie from the SBTi here, a migration towards a hybrid methodology. Because what we've seen, and Rebecca, your question touches on this, is that those that only use input-output methodologies, they're struggling to reduce them because you can only affect your spend. If your spend is something times something, then all you can change is your spend. So they're bringing in suppliers' primary data. It could be in the form of LCA data, it could be allocated data, it could even, they're bringing in the suppliers' direct primary data, scope 1 and 2 or more, and they're building that into their scope 3 inventory. That means that when they engage with their supplier and say they encourage their supplier to go RE100, zero out their scope 2 emissions, then that act that the supplier's taken is reflected in their scope 3 inventory. And we're seeing more and more companies do that, as I said, partially because of Amelie and SBTi. I hope that answered your question, Rebecca, but I will type as well. If we go on to the next slide, I only have 2 minutes left. So what we've seen is these companies have started to realize, more and more companies have realized that they need to engage with their suppliers and drive action with their supplier base to influence their scope 3 and meet their SBT. We've got a program called the Supply Chain Program, and you can see the types of sectors up here. Companies from all different sectors, all different regions, they've come together to ask their suppliers to disclose their information through CDP. Now, if we go on to the next slide, there are some pluses and minuses to what's happened. What they've done is they've had a phenomenal impact on their supplier base. We've seen more suppliers disclosing to CDP than ever before. In excess of 11,000 companies responded to this request. You can just see it's almost hockey sticking upwards because of the purchasing power, the importance of scope 3. What I would then go on to say is that, if you go on to the next slide, the data quality varies in year one. So it's really important. These companies came in, they asked their suppliers, some of them didn't respond, some of them had only just started their footprinting journey, some of them hadn't even set any target, let alone considered a science-based targets. And it really, what they've learned is that they need, particularly for their scope 3s, to have a 3-year arching plan to get their suppliers up to speed and to cascade action to really influence their scope 3 numbers. And what I'll close on, that what we've seen is that that cascade isn't happening. So here's a shout out to every company out there. Last year, when we surveyed 11,000 companies, only 38% of them said they actively engaged with suppliers on climate change. That means 62% aren't talking to their suppliers about climate change. If you're one of them, I would very much encourage you to take steps, talk to your procurement team and build that in. We really do need everyone to talk to business to business relationships to involve climate change to affect the change we need. And I'll stop there. I think that's just over 7 minutes. Thank you so much for having me. I'll hand over to Rodrigo Barrios from Tesco, and who will talk. Do you want me to do that, Steve? I think
that's perfectly fine, because I was gonna do the same. Yeah, thank you, Sonya. Thanks everyone for the awesome engagement in the Q&A. We're really going to be needing you to help us filter these questions with your upvotes. So do please give a little bit of your attention to the Q&A box. Have a look at those questions. Help us to decide which ones we're going to prioritize when we get to the Q&A. And now, yes, over to you, Rodrigo.
Thank you, Steve. And hi, everybody. It's really nice to be here to present a little bit what our strategy is at Tesco to tackle this very challenging subject, which is our supply chain footprint. So next slide, please. Next. Yes, so this chart really reflects how our footprint is distributed across different areas of the business. Now, this is a reiteration of the categories on scope 3. It's not the same distribution, but roughly reflects, I think, to a broader audience how our footprint is divided. So as you can see, this is our baseline for 2015. In 2019, last time we monitored our footprint, it has gone down a bit, mainly due to passive reductions and greening of the grid in the UK, but also because we have had a few operational wins when it comes to shifting our stores to renewable energy and a little bit on electric vehicle adoption. But basically, if you look at this chart, we see that 48% is our footprint linked to the products we sell. So basically purchased goods and services, which is the focus for today's session. And then another whopping 42% comes from customers using what they buy, so consumer use of products. So these are the two main areas in which we really need to work strategically to influence emission reductions, because of course it's mostly indirect. It's across our supply chain or our value chain in the case of consumer use. So Tesco's leverage is more limited than in the other areas in which it's most linked to scope 1 and 2, and we can have quicker wins directly from decision making at senior level management. So this is in a nutshell our footprint. Next slide, please. What we have done so far, I think we were back in 2009 the first retailer to speak about net zero. Back then we didn't really know what net zero, the implications of achieving net zero were. It was more of an ambition, but now we have targets in place that we announced last year, not only to achieve carbon neutrality for our own operations by 2035, but also across our whole supply chain by 2050. And we are in last stages to validate these targets, hopefully by the end of next month with a science-based target initiative, including the much awaited and to some degree uncertain emission reduction target for forest, land, and agriculture. So the famous FLAG target that we're also hoping to validate, as more than 20% of our scope 3 footprint lies in our agricultural supply chains. We have been working actively, especially with our large suppliers. Most of them are now reporting emissions data on a yearly basis. This is really useful for us to understand what the emission hotspots are and to see what the areas in which we need to collectively work with our suppliers are. And we have the first year of a successful program with sustainability-linked supply chain finance to encourage our suppliers to disclose their emission information and also set targets to achieve preferential rates with bridging loans, basically. And because the task of decarbonizing such a complex supply chain like the one we have at Tesco is really about identifying hotspot areas and working at the product level. We have also been trialing and testing different emission reduction interventions at the product level through the sustainable farming groups, which are basically closed groups with suppliers on key agricultural categories, and hopefully also using third-party verification schemes to further our agenda moving forward. Next slide, please. So as you can see, we have a plethora of targets in place. The green rectangle is of course our ultimate target, which is reaching net zero across all scopes by 2050. But this is fed by 3 groups of targets. One, our carbon neutral own operations target by 2035, which, as you can see from a retailer perspective, is really small. It's less than 4% of our overall footprint, but still feeds into this larger net zero journey. We have committed to renewable energy, 100% renewable energy across our stores by 2030. We already achieved it in 2020, and now we're hoping to change by 2028 all of our vehicles in our own fleet to electric. Beyond that, there is a big component of achieving this net zero that is how we engage our suppliers across the supply chain to commit to net zero as well. This is a shared responsibility, and we always tell our suppliers this is not adding an additional layer of responsibility to your business, because also when you calculate your scope 3, a big part of your scope 3 will be us as downstream emissions. So it's really about making visible that joint responsibility and accountability to net zero. So we're trying to encourage as much as possible, especially our large suppliers, to also commit to net zero. But as a laddered approach, we're asking first for them to submit their emissions data, hopefully by the end of this year, set their net zero targets, and then next year start validating those targets with a science-based target initiative. So these are our targets, internal targets linked to supplier engagement, and then we will have our flag target, which hopefully will be validated and ready by the end of next month, which is also fed by sub-targets. For example, our commitments to have deforestation and conversion-free soy across our supply chain by 2025, and the same then for palm oil and timber, which we know that in the end, when it comes to emissions linked to agriculture, feed, especially soya and feed, and the deforestation implications of that soya are actually a big part of that footprint. And beyond that, we have committed to halve the environmental impact of the average consumer basket in the UK by 2030 through our WWF commitment. This is a commitment that has been agreed also with 4 of our competitors: Sainsbury's, Co-op, Waitrose, and M&S. And now we're starting to identify how this outcomes within the basket metric, many linked to forests, marine, dietary shifts, are actually linked to the net zero targets. Because I think one of the trickiest things to navigate when it comes to net zero journey is really understanding how all the different targets ladder up to that net zero by 2050 ambition. So I think this target mapping is really important. Next slide, please. So what are our 3 priorities moving forward? There is an important area of the business, which in the overall landscape of things seems relatively small, but especially with own label products and in certain agricultural hotspots, there is an immense opportunity for Tesco to really drive actively decarbonization. So for a few product groups, which I will introduce later in this presentation, we are hoping to actively lead the way to have less emission intensity in our products. But then, as I mentioned earlier, this is we will not get even halfway with this side of the equation. We really need to put a lot of effort in supplier engagement, just because our supply chain is really complex and has a lot of suppliers involved. it is increasingly challenging to really gather, track, monitor, and provide feedback to the information coming from our suppliers when it comes to net zero. So what we're trying to do is to encourage them to set net zero targets for their business themselves, and this will of course transfer part of the accountability to the likes of CDP, Science Based Target Initiative, and other bodies who are more prepared to really guide this business towards net zero. So we're hoping to engage our suppliers not only in setting these targets, but also in sharing lessons from our own operations transitions. We've really achieved great success when it comes to reducing our scope 1 and 2. So we hope we can transfer tools and also leverage sustainable finance to support our suppliers as well in at least reducing their own scope 1 and 2 and monitor their scope 3. And of course, a lot of this journey to net zero will be about passive reductions, in which Tesco will most likely not play a central role, but we still have different resources to support a quicker transition in these passive reductions. For example, transition to greener energy, electric vehicles, the whole role of sequestration and removals in this process, which is of course a big nut to crack from a retailer perspective, and other areas in which Tesco as a market leader can play a role. Next slide, please. So as you can see in the slides, we have a big concentration of emissions in a few products. This modeling was done in 2019 based on weight, which was a very complicated exercise for us, given the fact that the products we sell are not, when it comes to volume, are not necessarily in terms of kilograms, but in terms of units. So each unit has a different weighing system. So it was a very granular process to transform all of this to volume, but we have this snapshot of where our emissions are most complicated. So the big four, which are pork, poultry, beef, and milk, are of course potentially our main hotspots to work on. As you can see, when beef and milk were number 1 and number 2 in our first calculation in 2015, when we factored in land use change and deforestation, pork and poultry gained the 2 first spots because of how sizable soya feed is in those product groups. So overall, this emissions coming from these agricultural products account for 24 for total footprint. And in many of these categories, we have own label products, which are actually the main, cover the main share of this product group. So there's a big opportunity for Tesco to drive active reductions in this space. And that's our first priority moving forward. Next slide, please. So this is the products that we have prioritized for this first iteration. Now the strategy for each of these products is different. In some cases, we have what we call sustainable farming groups with most of our supply chain. So the ability that we have to trial emission reduction innovations and solutions in that group and actually roll out that innovation in our whole supply chain is quite high. This is the case, for example, in fresh milk, potentially in beef, poultry, and other categories. In other areas, for example, salmon, most of the companies that we source from are actually big trading companies. So even though Tesco is huge and massive from a UK perspective, what we signify in terms of overall buying for these companies is quite negligible. So it's all about really industry collaboration and finding ways of working with these companies to drive collective action on decarbonization with other companies in the sector as well. And then there is the big complexity of the indirect sourcing commodities. Not only because our boundary of influence is also limited, but also because there's lack of transparency. So we're hoping that also this due diligence act coming soon that will integrate the traders in the net zero journey will be quite useful for commodities such as soy, palm oil, barley, sugar, etc. But this is where we're focusing our active decarbonization activity moving forward. Next slide, please. This is what we're trying to build for each of these groups. We are surveying our suppliers, really our growers and farmers at the product level, using different tools depending on how prepared these tools are to gather the holistic picture of each of the supply chains to build first this red waterfall that goes upwards, which is really identifying the emission sources of our supply chain, our specific supply chain, and then building this green downwards waterfall, which is the different interventions that we hope to implement to achieve net zero by 2050. So these pathways, we hope we'll have them ready by the end of this year, in alignment with this new requirement from the UK government for all listed companies to present transition pathways for our company. So this is the exercise we're trying to build at the product level. Next slide, please. And what we see is that this is, of course, very high level. We have a tailored draft strategy for each of these product groups. What we see is there's a first group of products in which there is really big opportunity for Tesco through the sustainable farming groups to trial technologies and practices to reduce emissions. This is what we call the active reductions. We're seeing stuff here, for example, like herbal leys, regen agricultural practices, especially in produce supply chains, methane inhibitors, feed additives, all of this fit under the first group. And then there is a second group in which deforestation is actually the main area of concern. I put beef and milk there. It's not really, beef and milk have quite a marginal share linked to deforestation and soya feed. But for the other categories in this group, really, if we solve the feed element and the soya, and we ensure, at least as an initial step, that all the soya we source is not leading to deforestation, and there are technologies out there, including DNA analysis and other advanced technologies to identify really where the soya is coming from. If we can solve that, we will tackle most of the emissions in this group. The ideal, of course, would be to shift to non-soya feed, but that will require a sort of a market-wide transition, which is a bit more mid-term. And then in other areas in which we have a lesser boundary of influence, about certification, transparency, and how we can work with other actors, including the traders, collectively to drive these emission reductions. The blue ones are the indirect sourcing, commodities. I'm just answering a question from the box. Next slide, please. So that's the first one, active decarbonization. Just a few more slides on my side. The second, as I mentioned, is how can we support our suppliers to set targets and go in their own operations transition. We have the Tesco Supplier Network, which has been a success, we would say, in really sharing knowledge with our supplier base. We're constantly populating that website with new resources. There is a lot of concern from our suppliers when it comes to scope 3, monitoring, tracking. They, to a large extent, don't feel prepared to have a net zero ambition for their business because they don't know. They are afraid they will have more than 40% of their footprint on scope 3, and they feel they're not in a position to really track and make a commitment for their supply chain. So we're hoping to use the Tesco Supplier Network website to transfer most of the knowledge. So in that sense, we would like to be more in contact with all the panelists in this session to really try to incorporate your resources as well to support our suppliers in this transition. We are leveraging supply chain finance. We had a first program with Santander, which, as I mentioned, encourages climate disclosures, but we're trying to roll out new programs linked more to capital expenditures and renewable energy transition, because Tesco, of course, as a big player in the market, can have preferential rates in many of these different areas of the financial sector. And then there's the question of how can we partner with other big branded suppliers like Coca-Cola, Unilever, etc., to work on common supply chain transition as well. So next slide, please. And finally, we think we might have a role in supporting this and underpinning this passive reductions. We have, from our initial modeling, we have identified that actually new technologies that are not ready for market yet can play a big role in reducing our scope 3 footprint. We have the WWF Innovation Fund, which is part of our partnership. So we encourage any startup or innovator in this group to really apply to this innovation fund. And we are using this tool to really identify technologies for supply chain decarbonization and roll them out in our supply chain. So we can have a role in this new technology wave, hopefully. There is, of course, the shift to more sustainable diets, which is always a very complex terrain to navigate from a retailer standpoint, where we're increasingly trying to include more plant-forward products in our ready meals, especially, and most of them feeding our meal deals. So hopefully supporting that transition step by step. And then I think there is this big question, and we're constantly receiving requests and proposals from different stakeholders in our supply chain about carbon credits. We always say we want to decarbonize first, work on sequestration and removals later, but we now know that it won't be as sequential as we initially thought. We really need to have a stake and a position when it comes to the carbon market. So we're hoping to be as close as we can to the discussion, to the soil carbon code, to the other different discussions that are happening right now, to ensure that the carbons that we purchase as we become active in this market truly have additionality and permanence. And in that sense, we'll remain very close to those discussions. Next, please. And just as a final reflection, I think the main things that we are experiencing right now, I think, and these are similar in other retailers and big companies, it's all about data availability and quality of the data. We are gathering a lot of information from our large suppliers. When we say large suppliers, these are our top roughly 400 in terms of cost of goods. So in that sense, not volume, but cost of goods. But the information that we gather is all the group level. So it's really difficult to use that information to understand what our Tesco specific footprint is. And we're trying to increasingly have bigger collaboration with other retailers competitively to hopefully be able at some point to carve out the Tesco specific emissions to really assess the hotspots in our specific supply chain. But then with this whole scope 3 piece, it's really challenging to identify KPIs which we can monitor year on year without the need to use secondary data and industry aggregates. So we are still struggling to develop a KPI framework where we are certain that the different efforts that we are undertaking to decarbonize are being reflected in those year-on-year modeling exercises. So the KPI framework is also a challenging one for us. As I mentioned, there's different boundaries of influence. So how can we work with other retailers in those supply chains in which Tesco might be a smaller player to really drive these changes? And finally, it's a very difficult year to start driving this decarbonization efforts. We're seeing a lot of hardship, especially at the farmer level, when it comes to raw materials. It's hardship. At the same point, it might be opportunity because it's an ideal year to start, for example, testing regenerative agricultural practices in certain produce supply chains because fertilizer cost is so high. So we might see opportunities as well, driven by this cost of living crisis. But still, there is the big question of how can we leverage sustainable finance to bridge the gap, especially in this upcoming years for the necessary net zero investment, and how can we ensure that we absorb that cost across our supply chain so consumers and customers are not facing this increase in costs across our product base. And I think that's all for me. Next slide. I think it's the last one. Yes. So thank you, and I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rodrigo. That's sobering, I have to say. I don't think anybody on this call would have thought getting to net zero is going to be easy. But you know, seeing that you really presented the scale of the challenge there in a quite compelling way. Thanks very, very much. Okay, we've got an absurd number of questions to get to. So no pressure, Isobel. Let's have our last presentation, and then we'll get stuck in and we'll see how many of those we can get through. So over to you.
Thank you, Steve. That leads quite nicely onto my opener. Rome wasn't built in a day, and neither will building a truly sustainable world. We've seen the challenges there from the other speakers. And I think that these platforms that we were able to join, thank you for having us, really enable us to start breaking it down. So at Owen Mumford, we've spent the last 18 months defining how to achieve carbon reduction that will keep us well below 1.5 degrees. So let me tell you about our approach. Next slide, please. At Owen Mumford, a global medical device manufacturer based in the UK, we've been pioneering the advancement of medical administration, blood sampling and testing for 70 years. We are striving for true sustainability, by which I mean not causing unintended consequences to other impact areas, getting it right the first time, and actually reducing our carbon footprint. doing that through the reduction of the impact that our products cause. Next slide, please. Oh, no, wait, sorry, back one. We'd already skipped one, thank you. So our journey, it really started back in 2014 with the launch of our environmental steering group. Since then, we've signed up to many initiatives, the UN Sustainable Development Goals, the science-based targets, business ambition for 1.5 degrees, Race to Zero movement, the United Nations Global Compact, and in 2021, we were awarded B Corp certification for our corporate social responsibility. So our drive for true sustainability is demonstrated through our commitment to achieve science-based targets, a 50% reduction by 2030, and a net zero by 2045, and that's across scopes 1, 2, and 3. Next slide, please. Thank you. Let me talk you through our journey over the past 18 months. I'm a design engineer and specialise in sustainable product development. I joined Owen Mumford in 2021, where we started with a scope 3 screening of our emissions. This highlighted a 92% contribution from purchased goods and services. We also carried out an LCA, or life cycle assessment, on one of our products. This was so that we could understand which life cycle stages are the most damaging. So that's from raw materials, distribution, manufacturing, use stage, through to end of life. Understanding the whole life cycle of a product from start to finish enables you to pinpoint the hotspots. For us, raw materials from this product's LCA contributed 52% of the product's overall impact. So these two results led us to a supplier engagement product. This was so that we could ensure that when we made changes, we were doing the right thing right from the beginning, so going in the right direction from the start. So we asked ourselves, how do we reduce the impact of our materials or our purchased goods and services? Well, we started by engaging with suppliers who provided us with sustainable product solutions, and we looked at their data. So while we were reviewing the data on their sustainable products, we found that there was a huge lack of consistency in measurement, and that was all the way from the methodology to the scope and boundaries of the assessment. As we were unable to comparatively measure the environmental impact of these materials, it kind of rendered the data inadequate for our purposes in helping us to define a way that we could achieve our aims by using less impactful material choices. There are so many different ways to measure the environmental impact of a product or service, but there's really no international standard. This is, of course, a particular concern for businesses who don't maybe have expertise in this area. How do they make sure that they're making the right choices, not heading in the wrong direction, not investing in a solution which does not reduce the overall impact? We want to encourage suppliers to reduce the impact of their products, but us as industry as a whole, we need a way to directly compare the environmental impacts. So how is Owen Mumford dealing with this issue? We're creating a process in collaboration with our suppliers where we're asking our suppliers to use a specific methodology. And from this, we can then compare directly. It is a project, it's underway, but that's the approach that we're taking. Next slide, please. However, we are not just stopping with working with our suppliers. We know that ultimately, if we can reduce the impact of our products, we can reduce all of our up and downstream emissions. After all, we are another business's scope 3. So we know that we must act on what we as a business put out the door. To this end, we have spent a very intense 6 months developing a specialist customized tool through a partnership with Praise Sustainability, who are experts in LCA. With this tool, we can achieve a 99% accuracy in assessing the potential environmental impact of our products. The tool uses life cycle assessment in a proactive way rather than a reactive way. And it measures the impact of current and concept products right from the front end of development through into industrialization and beyond. It ensures that we are making the right choices at the beginning so that we're doing the right thing. It means that we know we're not causing unintended consequences. It's driving innovation hugely because it's a huge challenge to achieve the targets we're setting ourselves. This is done through the quantitative assessment of designs, and it is helping us to achieve then those carbon reductions. We can also use it to help us set product and business level targets. We can use it to support business decisions across supply, manufacturing, and distribution. And through to the end, we can take these products through the tool into a fully ISO 14040 compliant LCA with no surprises at the end. Next slide, please. But we're just one company. Imagine what would happen if we all banded together and demanded a comparable measurement for the environmental impact of products and services. Standardization in the measurement and reporting of climate change is achievable through cross-industry collaboration. It will enable easy tendering, remove any ability to greenwash, and drive accountability, ultimately enabling global emissions to stay well below 1.5 degrees through fact-based reductions of global carbon emissions. And eventually, we could realize a truly sustainable world. Thank you. Back to Steve.
Thanks, Isobel. I'm just noticing in the chats, so apologies to everyone that thought the webinar was going to end at 11. We haven't, in fact, extended the time, so we've got 32 minutes to try and take on some of these questions. And of course, if you do have to log off, we're going to have the recording to share. And with unanswered questions, we will take a stab at answering some of those offline and providing you with some answers to those in our follow-up comms. So apologies for any confusion around that. Okay, thanks again, Isobel. So let's move on now. Let's stop sharing those slides and let's get stuck into the Q&A. Amelie and Sonya, if you're there we go. But I'm gonna use my moderator's privilege because I think there's a big question that I haven't seen in the Q&A yet, and I think it's an important one, and it's just, so this is probably directed more to Isobel and Rodrigo to start. Is a company's carbon footprint or their carbon disclosures actually influencing purchasing decisions at this time with your companies, or do you see we're moving in that direction? Rodrigo, you did speak about you're starting to engage with suppliers, and we've been on the receiving end of that. I just the other day had to fill in a form from one of our member companies, wanting to know where we were at on a net zero journey, but it was very gentle. No implication that if we weren't on the journey, that that would be the end of our commercial relationship, as it were. And I think going right back to the survey we did at the beginning, the biggest challenge that was noted by over half of our attendees today was lack of data. Maybe Isobel, to you first. Is that something? You spoke a lot about the inconsistencies in data. Are we getting to a point where you would tell someone, get your carbon house in order, or we're not going to be able to do business with you?
Yeah, so this is part of the process that we're going through. We're looking to build a sort of a policy for the supply team to be able to understand what impacts, what other companies are doing. But as I say, there's so many different ways to report and so many different factors to take into consideration. It's quite difficult to pinpoint that down to which one really is doing better. Within R&D, we're focusing on material input. So we're a mainly polymer-based producer. So we're trying to understand which kind of polymers we can use and looking really at that feedstock through to how they're produced into polymers. So hence the material study that we're doing is to really understand which materials are most impactful. And ultimately, that will mean that we buy from one supplier rather than another. The other thing that we're seeing is on the other side of things, our customers are coming to us and asking, what are we doing for sustainability? What is our sustainability agenda, which I've just spoken about? But they're also asking for life cycle assessments. And my question to that is, why? What is it that you actually want to know from our life cycle assessment? Are you wanting to just tick a box to say you've got one for this product? Or actually, are you wanting to measure against another company? And if you are, hence my call for methodology, then we need to put that measurement in because you could get one from one person, one from another, and they wouldn't be directly comparable. So it would then be unfair on one of those companies.
Rodrigo, where are you at with putting the hammer down on suppliers?
So I think that is $1 million question, and in a nutshell, we're not yet there. I think for several different reasons. For example, right now, human rights is a requirement. Human rights threshold is a requirement for all supplier engagement, supplier relations. The reason why climate is not at the same level is, first, we haven't done enough work to really understand kind of the double materiality and the climate risk, like embedding climate risk as well in our commercial decisions. I think when risk is factored into the equation and not just, you know, the wishful thinking of that net zero transition moving forward, but the actual risk that not tackling emissions in certain supply chains entails for the business, it's easier to argue that we need to embed it in commercial strategies as well. But then the other two reasons are, we have a lot of different commitments in the environmental side of things that are not necessarily climate. We have nature, we have packaging, we have waste. So there's several different areas in which we need to balance different indicators. What we're trying to do is creating a sort of algorithm that really has a holistic picture of the environmental journey of our suppliers, not just climate, before we make that decision to make it contingent or supplier relations to those indicators. And I guess the final thing is we're worried that if we are too strict right now, what we will do in practice is we will leave our smaller suppliers aside, just because it's so difficult to set these targets and validate them. It requires resources and expertise. So what we're seeing is that the tail of our suppliers is not really in a position to do that commitment right now. So we want to ensure that we are supporting those suppliers as much as we can. So when it becomes actually a decision that if you don't have certain climate indicators, you cannot do business with us, we have leveled the playing field, and all of our suppliers are in the same position of continuing doing business with us and not just the big ones. So hopefully in a couple of years we will be in that position. We're working in that direction, but right now it's just a request and not a requirement, basically. Okay, well, and you know that's to some extent where we want to come in as well, in supporting the smaller companies on the journey and moving us all forward. Sonya, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I was just going to say, well, what you guys have just been talking about is a trend we're starting to see with some of the purchasers we work with. So there's some subtleties to not doing business, but I've seen in excess of 30 companies that we, the supply chain members, that have started integrating climate change data that we give them into their balanced scorecards. Now that's a really subtle way of doing it, but what it means is that if you're a company, and Del says this out loud, if you're a company and the quality is the same of the products, goods and services, the price is the same, all of those things, and your competitor is doing climate change, meeting these KPIs, and you're not, the business will go to them. So they're building it in, and it's been really interesting to see the impact that's had on the suppliers and the numbers, because it's become material to them, affects their competitiveness. And then another example, BT, I did a webinar with them yesterday. They openly stated, and I need to remember this exactly, for contracts over a certain amount, I think it was 5 million, they have a contract clause in asking their supplier to set an SBT. That's, again, building it into the purchasing processes. So I think what the other panelists have alluded to is that a lot of the big companies are on their way to do it, if they're not quite there. And I've seen some of them tip over that line already.
I think that's a really important point, isn't it? That even where it's not a mandatory requirement, all things being equal, there's almost certainly competitive advantage to the company that has some action to talk about, and they're actually talking about it. So a combination of actual emissions reductions and target setting and credible disclosures do bring competitive advantage. So I think, big message we want loud and clear out there to everybody that don't wait to be forced. There's already competitive advantage to be had from taking action. Okay, fabulous. Thank you for that and indulging me. We're going to get started on the questions. 75 I see outstanding, so quite a daunting task. Thanks, Sonya and Amelie and others for doing some written answers. I think where we've already got a written answer, we won't come back to that for now, just because we've got so many other questions. And so let's get started. Really interesting question from Jack. How is the circular economy accounted for in purchased goods and services? For example, if a company purchases a refurbished laptop, would they need to include the full embodied carbon of a new laptop plus emissions from refurbishment, or is there some dispensation around that? Now, that's feels like a pretty tricky sort of technical question. So I'm steering it your way, Amelie, to start, or Sonya. Yeah, do you?
Amelie, you're welcome to check in. What I might do is provide a written answer for that, because actually it's a really interesting question that you have, and there is some. The greenhouse gas protocol is wonderful, and I'm the biggest fan of it. Helped contribute to it. We kept it broad because it was one size fits every single company in every single sector. So there is. I'll provide a written answer to that. I will do that now. But in essence, it's about, and it always is, it's the explanation, building it into your methodology. When you build in the approach you take, as long as you can explain what you're doing, there are ways for accounting it. But let me write that. We'll give you some links as well that are helpful.
Anything to add, Amelie?
Yeah, I think this is definitely an interesting question, especially, with the rise of like circularity in, discussions. So from a target setting point of view, any avoided emissions by purchasing a product that would have lower emissions compared to something that is built from scratch. So that avoided emissions kind of inventory is not really counted towards achievement towards science-based targets and should be accounted separately. But I think, that's why that we need a lot of engagement with your suppliers to ask them on how they manage to calculate that. The point is to always go towards the lower level of emissions if you have an option. So yeah, I think I mean there's no perfect answer to this, I think, but I think as we have more methodologies coming into place that is related to circularity, I think we'll have a better answer, hopefully.
Yeah, I think that's it, isn't it? There's a risk of perverse outcomes here where everybody would clearly recognize upcycling or recycling or circularity is beneficial, and we do need to find a way to reflect that in reporting, and work in progress, I think, is probably the answer. But look forward to seeing what Sonya writes down. So moving right along, Marcus asks, which instruments can you recommend for calculating emissions for capital goods besides the Qantas tool? So a plug for the Qantas tool. That's, I'm afraid, more hands-on than I usually get. Do we have a volunteer? Is someone familiar with the Qantas tool or other tools for calculating emissions from capital goods?
I mean, there are lots of them out there. So the majority of them you have to pay for. So I could point you to some emissions calculators that we know. I'll get a link for you that we've had references from companies that have worked with them in the past. I'll find you those links and put them in there. In terms of free tools, there are a limited amount. The Qantas one is a free tool. DEFRA has some conversion factors that are free. And then the last one I would point out, if you're a small to medium enterprise, there is something called the Climate Hub, SME Climate Hub. They have some free tools available for you to support you, the smaller companies who are trying to do their upstream footprinting for the first time. The one thing I would say about the free tools is that, you know, they are resource constricted, so they are limiting in what you can do with them. But they are out there. But as for the other tools, let me just grab those links. Sorry, I was just trying to finish the question from one before, but I'll grab a link and put that in the chat in a second.
Rodrigo, are you using any third-party software or?
So we actually have a big gap when it comes to estimating the footprint of our capital goods. That was one of the main areas in which we need to put additional effort. I think we're now integrating more Tesco Bank on the one hand, and then our pension fund, which is a pension fund that covers 500,000 employees roughly. So it has big implications for capital goods. So I might get back on that one in a few months' time, because right now I'm not fully aware of the tools out there in the market.
Okay, thanks. Isobel, are you using any software in this space?
At this time, no. As I said, we're focusing more around the actual materials and trying to measure them through a life cycle assessment process. And so the software that we're using for our internal tool is SEMA Pro using EcoInvent data. So full LCA methodology, but at the moment, nothing higher level than that.
Okay. Really great to see our audience chipping in with suggestions. And so do please keep that going. If you're using some software to help you in this space, do please share it. If in fact you think it's good, maybe don't necessarily need you to share it if you're not so happy with it. All right, Jean has a question. How can the company address the challenge of acquiring accurate data if it has a large number of suppliers, for example, larger than 5,000 in a reporting year? So I suppose, Rodrigo, anything to add from what you said in your presentation to this point?
Sorry, can you please repeat, Steve? I lost you there.
How are you addressing the challenge of acquiring accurate, maybe I should underline accurate data when you have, you know, a huge number of suppliers?
Yeah, I think it's a very complicated process, and I think right now we have an own sort of built-in solution, a questionnaire that we use with suppliers to survey them and ask for very high-level information on scope 1 and 2 mostly, and then scope 3 is optional. What we're hopefully we'll do moving forward is we'll try to piggyback on external tools that our competitors are using, because we're seeing that it's easier to have better and more accurate information where our suppliers are all reporting in one same platform, and hopefully that, because in the end we're asking for group level emissions, so hopefully that single reporting platform will enable us to also carve out what is specific for Tesco and start building our scope 3 footprint bottom up, which is something we're not doing right now. With a tool that we have right now, it's very research intensive. We have to go back constantly to suppliers, asking them for some gaps in their reporting, so it's not really that efficient. At the same time, it's really tricky when it comes to agriculture for several different reasons. I think there's a lot of tools out there that are very good for farm level footprinting analysis, not necessarily for companies that are working in the agricultural sector and they have facility emissions, farm emissions, and logistic emissions at the same time. And also there's this big discussion as to how agricultural companies are factoring sequestration. So I think just general reflection, we put a lot of effort into have a one-on-one sort of accompanied process of reporting with our suppliers, large ones, to hopefully get the best image that we can from their footprint. But there's a lot of methodological gray areas that we still need to work on to really have a more streamlined automatic process of data collection. We're not yet there.
Okay, let's keep moving. The question, so first also just maybe a request again to keep on voting, upvoting the questions. Now we seem to be adding questions more quickly than we're answering them. I can't get down to the bottom of the list to see everything that's there, so I'm going to have to rely upon our audience. If there's a winner near the bottom, please do give it your vote, move it up to the top, and we'll deal with the questions that are getting the most votes. The question from Paul is, we use suppliers from across Europe, UK, and the Far East. He's engaging with all of them, particularly regarding their carbon footprint. In the Far East, they see sustainability as a Western thing. In the UK, they don't know anything about it. And in Europe, they're at all different stages in the journey. So the question, until there are worldwide legal requirements, probably including taxes, penalties for non-compliant businesses, how do we ensure suppliers are all aligned and on the same sustainability journey? Continuing them as a supplier is not an option. It's kind of what you were talking about, isn't it, Isobel? Are you getting much joy as sort of working as a sector, trying to work collectively? Are you finding you can create a coalition to sort of drive maybe some consistency, or are we all just sort of praying to the ISSB to rescue us from this dilemma?
It's an interesting question. There's a lot of talk within our industry and medical industry about, as I say, about LCA and measuring the impact of products. But with the inconsistency in different methodology, it's difficult to measure. Although through a couple of committees and meetings that I'm on, there is definitely a call for how do we standardize this so that we can almost have a flag, kite mark to say that this is the number, so that you can look at a product and say this one versus this one is better, which is also going to drive competitiveness massively, which is really important. So yeah, we're building networks with people within our industry to understand how we can create rules. There's a thing called a product category rule with life cycle assessment, how we can build those sorts of rules for when we as businesses are building what that looks like from an environmental impact.
What do we think? Could science-based targets be that unifying platform?
Absolutely. We'd love for there to be somebody in those areas that are going to go, we will help drive this. We're very happy to spearhead, but we need a platform that's international, that can bring all of those different companies who want to be driving change together.
Rodrigo.
No, just to add on that, I think also the fact that some of the big corporates, the Fortune 500 or the big companies in the UK have committed to supply chain targets is also one step in that direction. Just because we're not focusing on territorial UK emissions, but emissions across our whole global supply chain. So we have to navigate. For example, now we're seeing potential methane taxes in New Zealand. Big part of our lamb that we source from Tesco is from New Zealand. Same with palm oil in Indonesia, and then other geographies and different legislation that exists in those countries. So I think as we work with suppliers in those geographies as well, we're kind of driving the whole global supply chain towards this net zero journey as well. So I think the Scope 3 piece really has a big implication on this cross-boundary alliances and net zero collective work. So I think it's a great step forward.
Thanks. Sonya.
I'm just going to build on what Rodrigo and Isobel said. The work that they're doing, it does influence the governments. We, because of CDP's a global not-for-profit, and we've got all these companies, we're constantly asked, we have an entire policy decision because government's coming to us saying, we're thinking about doing this, what's the best practice? The transition plans working group were involved in that in the UK. The Dutch government announced something similar about transition plans. So the work that it doesn't always have to be that you wait for government to cascade down to businesses. Actually, businesses can drive the ambition almost up to governments, and certainly across the supply chains. And that was really what SBTi and We Mean Business, that entire coalition, founded, because they wanted to influence the Paris Agreement to say, don't use business as a scapegoat. We mean business on climate change. We want you to meet our ambition. So don't underestimate your power of your voice. You influence government as much as they influence you back.
Thanks. Yeah, I think a really important consideration that we really saw that at COP26, that business seemed to be driving the ambition far more than governments were. And we obviously need to see a lot more of that as we go into COP27. Okay, Ryan has I think a really practical, interesting question. Is there a standard set of questions to ask our suppliers when we want to calculate our portion of Scope 3 emissions to report? We want to ask, but want to use standard questions to make it easy for our suppliers to comply. Amelie, could I go to you at this one, maybe?
I was going to say, actually, if you look at the CDP questionnaire, it has a pretty good set of questions. I would say that, there is a specific supply chain module that asks, your suppliers for overall emissions as well as emissions you attribute towards that relationship. So that's where I would direct you towards. But typically, the baseline, as always, is to go back to the greenhouse gas protocol standard, because that is the basis of how the inventory is supposed to be calculated.
Rodrigo.
And I think depending also on the sector in which your company operates, there are also a lot of sectorial guidelines that are aligned with the SBTi. RAP is doing great work, for example, in the food and beverage sector. So there's a lot of questions at the product level, what to ask a coffee producer, what to ask a tomato producer, to that level of detail. So there's a lot of resources online. So yeah, useful to visit those kind of industry coalitions and initiatives as well.
And of course, bearing in mind, the materiality and salience, and we don't want to put so much energy into reporting and getting everything in the right category at the expense of directing our resources towards actual emissions reduction. So we've got to keep our eye on that, really the ultimate prize. But I think really key, we need reporting and disclosures in order to make those achievements and direct our pressures in the right way. So thanks for that question, Ryan. Okay, I'm going to leave. It's showing me, Sonya, that you're answering Kate's question, and it looks like a really interesting one, but I'll let you continue writing and we'll skip down to Annabelle's question. What would be a recommendation for quantifying and also reducing purchased service emissions when the service provider is a large corporation such as Microsoft or a large consultant company, especially when you don't have significant influence to drive engagement? Do we have a volunteer? We're a little more into the goods with our group today. So
I think to answer Kate's one whilst everyone else thinks about that one.
Sure.
Because it's difficult trying to do both at the same time. So Kate asked one about how do you start to integrate actual data from your supply chain if you're estimating your footprint using an EEIO factors. Start with your spend, Kate. Every time, this is what Scope 3 is modeled on. If you look at your spend, you can see what you're spending with whom, what you're buying. If you're putting most of it through the input-output calculator, use that for them and then portion out, say, this is what I've seen other companies do. My top 20% of spend is with 500 companies or 100 companies. I've got good data from 50 of them. So top 10% of spend, I'm going to use their primary data. And then the other 95% of spend, I'm going to use my input output and then add them together at the end. That's what I was alluding to with the hybrid methodology. I'll share the page number specifically, but it's in the Greenhouse Gas Scope 3 Protocol Guidance. You don't have to stick to one approach for all of your spend. You could do 5% on LCA, 10% on primary data for suppliers, and then doing math in my head, 75% on input output. Does that make sense? Always go back to your spend because you have to account for 100% spend. All right, I'll stop there. What was the second question?
Well, first, Rodrigo, did you want to come in on that, or did you want to?
Yeah, no, on the services.
Okay.
So I think that the first thing that we need to do, at least from Tesco's standpoint, is to understand what the extent of that footprint is. I think we are, as you mentioned, Steve, quite focused on the product side because it's our core business, but we have a huge footprint when it comes to goods not for resale. We're a massive company and we're hiring consultancies, services and travel support, cleaning services and other, facility services in the office. So there is a big footprint there. The goods not for resale team isn't committed to the net zero target as well, but we haven't measured the extent of the footprint. So I guess the first stage for a company who's not directly dealing with services or not providing services, but is actually engaging in services not for resale is to actually measure it. And I think RAP and other industry alliances are doing great work to also make visible the side of the footprint that is usually ignored when you're in the purchased goods side of the equation.
We're really running out of time now. So I feel I want to just address this question that Joe has put in the chat, just because he did go through the Q&A originally. So Sonya, do you see that? And do you, he's just basically asking about purchasing on behalf of clients. So I'm not sure if you want to look at that, or if the company is only purchasing on behalf of their clients that they do not have the decision power, does the purchase submission fall under that company's boundary? Amelie, do you have a view on that? It's a bit technical. It's just right at the bottom of the chat box now. And
I did write it in my opinion, but there is a subtlety here. So for instance, look at where the contract is. So if you are contracting, even if it's on behalf of someone, but that contract exists between you and a supplier, that's your scope 3 emissions. There are very few cases, for instance, Visa probably wouldn't be accountable for whatever I happen to spend at Tesco, if that makes sense, despite me using the Visa card. My contracts with, the implications, my contracts directly with Tesco. If you take Tesco themselves, they are ultimately buying what their customers want them to. They don't, there are some, I don't want to put words into your mouth there, Rodrigo, but you don't fully decide what it is you want to buy. If they all decide, like my son really loves Petit Filou, you have to buy the Petit Filou because that's what your customers want, but that's still their scope 3. Does that make sense? More often than not, you have to include it. There are very few, there are exceptions, but there are very few out there. And it's usually around the contracting aspects.
Perfect. And on that note, thank you, Amelie. Thank you, Sonya. Thank you, Rodrigo. And thank you, Isobel. It's been a fantastic session. I've learned a tremendous amount. I'm sure that the audience has likewise. We are going to share the recording. We're going to talk to you guys about sharing the slides. We're going to try and answer some more of these questions in our follow-up docs. We're going to produce a key takeaways where we'll pull out all of the links that have been shared. So we'll try and make sure that everybody gets maximum value. One more session in the series to go. Recordings of all the previous sessions are available on our website, and some more great events coming up. And I'm going to hand back to Patrick to wrap us up and take us home. Patrick.
Yeah, thank you, Steve, and thank you to all of the speakers today. That was really brilliant. We did manage to get through quite a few questions there, which was great. So as Steve says, we've got one more event in the series, looking at fuel and energy related activities. So that's on the 5th of July, 10 till 11. So feel free to scan that QR code and get registered there. As I mentioned at the start as well, we do have a session at Climate Action Week. So investor perspectives on climate and human rights. That's on the 27th of June. Again, the QR code will take you to a registration page. Just one more session to flag. In the Pride Plus, building LGBTIQ plus inclusive business, we've got a session the 29th of June looking at authentic allyship. So that is all for today. Thank you again to the speakers, to Steve, and most of all the audience. Some brilliant questions coming in. And thanks so much for your engagement. I look forward to seeing you at one of the next sessions. Thank you very much.